and thank you for joining us. My name is Professor Peter Nash from Griffith University in beautiful downtown Brisbane. And today we're very fortunate to be able to have a chat with my friend and colleague, Professor of Infectious Diseases, Public Health, Preventive Medicine, and Ophthalmology. I don't know how that fits in, but he might explain it later. Oregon Health and Science University in the US, and also one of the CSF Steering Committee members, Professor Kevin Winthrop. Welcome, Kevin. Great for you to give us some time today. We're going to be discussing a recent publication in Rheumatology and Therapy, and it falls into the vaccination story that we are presently coping with COVID and with influenza and pandemics and our immune suppressed patients. So we hope this will be of particular interest. This paper looks at influenza adverse events in patients, not just rheumatoid, but ulcerative colitis, PSA, and they've chosen the Tofacitinib clinical development program to have a look at. So can you tell us a little bit about what made you want to do this study and why you chose TOFA program?
You bet, Peter. And yeah, we'll talk about the ophthalmology thing someday over beer. It's worth a chat and worth a beer. So this study was kind of hatched early in the pandemic when we all had lots of questions around JAK inhibitors and how they influence the risk of viral infections in general. Of course, we were all worried about COVID at the time. We had no data at that time. So we thought, what data do we have laying around? What's existing that might shed some light on the risk of COVID or just viral illness in general? So we looked at our long-term extension data, and we thought, hey, what data piles are around? So with TOFA, of course, there was an extensive clinical development program and a number of indications. So there was lots of phase 2, phase 3 data, and it could all be combined for various things. And this was a burning question. So you and I have both worked extensively with TOFA and research around TOFA, and so this was just something that seemed like a no-brainer to do. So that's what we did. We piled all this data together across indications and decided to look at influenza. Now, these are not easy things to look at. It's how it is. You're an investigator in these trials, and someone gets what looks like the flu. You maybe mark it down as an adverse event, label it flu. Whether it's truly influenza or not, unless you tested them, you're not going to know. So we know that, people do these trials, we get this data. We know some of these cases labeled as flu aren't flu. And we know, some of the cases that aren't labeled as flu are probably flu. So that being said, the limitations of this type of analyses, or just really in general in studying viral illness like this, that you do the best you can.
And was this all done pre-COVID pandemic or through the whole pandemic?
Yeah, I'd have to look at when we started this, but my recollection is we started doing it at the start of the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic hit, and I think in the first few months we all were struggling, like, wonder what JAK inhibitors do the risk of COVID or other viral infections. So that was when we started doing it. Yeah.
And you chose interesting groups, like the UC group are 10 years younger. The PSA are somewhere in the middle, and the rheumatoid's a little bit older. Were there major differences between the groups? I think steroid use might be different, something like that.
Yeah, so they were different in age, a bit different in comorbidities, of course. Difference in steroid use, I think the UC group was using more steroids, which would be typical of IBD. So yeah, there were some differences at baseline, but a lot of people had risk factors for badness, I would say, in terms of you get COVID or flu or something else, you have a higher risk of a more severe outcome.
I was just looking through the table. Interestingly, the RA patients, 1 in 3 is obese. The UC patients aren't, like 14%. Yeah. And same with just funny little things like the PSA patients, only 20% were on a steroid, whereas half the RAs are on a steroid. So there are all these interesting little background quirks to the thing. So how did you go about it? What was the methods?
Pretty standard and similar to studies we've done before. I think there was a phase 1 trial in there, but most of it was phase 2, 3, and a few phase 4 studies, RCTs and LTEs. And we took that data and simply combined it across indication. We found all these events labeled as influenza or influenza-like illness events. And we piled them all together. We calculated incidence, time to first event, calculated incidence, censored people at the time of first event, and, looked at incidence across the different disease indications, looked at incidence associated with various, risk factors, steroid use, methotrexate use, tofa dose. Some people in this were on tofa 10. Remember, this was back in the glory days where you could use 10. And of course, UC patients were using 10. So, that was pretty similar. And then I believe we modeled, risk factors for this outcome. So at the end, we kind of threw, again, our covariates were all those things I mentioned, potential risk factors, as well as underlying disease, to see what was associated with flu.
And you had a good number of patients, something like 8,000 RA patients, 500 TOFA, a fair number of patients. And this was a H1N1. Does that matter which particular strain of flu was going through the population at the time?
No, I think, over the time period these studies were done, it would have been any flu. Certainly at some time points, H3N2 were more common, or H1N1 was more common. Probably in 1 or 2 of the years here, B was more common. Actually, we had a couple of big B years. So this would have been, encompassing any type of flu that was coming through. And again, as I said before, there's misclassification, right? Some of these cases probably aren't real. And I'm sure we didn't find some that were labeled as nasopharyngitis, and they were really flu. So.
Yep. I better correct that. There was 8,000 RA patients on TOFA, of whom 500 had an influenza AE. Now, when you rank the AEs, are there some that are important and others that are just a nuisance? Is there like serious infection compared to not so serious infection?
Well, we certainly looked at the ones that were labeled as serious. It was a small percent of these. But we did try to we basically captured any AE that had influenza as a term. So, I think the ones labeled as influenza are probably much more likely to be influenza. Some of the others, influenza-like illness. That is what we track from a public health standpoint, of course. But again, some of those aren't real. I have to ask you to remind me. I think the percent of cases that were serious and ended up hospitalization was quite small. But
it was. Yeah, it's quite small. But it's interesting. You did have data from the adalimumab group, from a placebo group, from a methotrexate group for comparison purposes, and it does look like there's a dose response, 5 BD to 10 BD, which is interesting.
Yeah, if I remember these results. I remember the rates were highest in UC, and they were maybe almost double some of the other indications or PSA, but they were definitely higher in UC. It surprised me a little bit because they were younger people. On the other hand, I think there was more steroid use there, and that probably explained that. And there was a dose effect. Certainly, we saw higher rates with 10 versus 5, which would be consistent with just infections across the board with TOFA and other JAK inhibitors, really. And that 10, of course, was more commonly used in the UC group too. So I think probably that and the steroid issue is why they had the higher rates.
Higher rates. Now, you probably won't know, but one of the commonest things we see is a nice, stable RA patient doing well. They get a vax. It doesn't have to be COVID. It can be the influenza vax, and it flares their arthritis. You wouldn't have captured any of that in this particular study.
No, and in fact, we didn't have a lot of vaccine information, if I remember right, in the study. I don't think that prior vaccination of flu was tracked for all the studies. I think in some studies it probably was, but I don't believe that was something we had to analyze because I don't think it's in the model. You have to look at the paper, but I don't remember that being something we had. It's too bad, because if we had that systematically, it'd be nice to analyze whether it made
And your gut feeling, is that a real thing or just a one-off coincidental thing?
that someone flared after a vaccine. Yeah, the studies that have looked at that formally in larger populations, of course, tend not to see an association. That being said, that doesn't mean that there's individual cases where it occurs. I mean, you see RA flare after a natural infection sometimes, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so I don't see why you couldn't see it after a non-natural infection.
Yep, fair enough.
Like a vaccine.
And just to put some numbers in there, of the 8,000 RA, 1.7% were serious and 8 patients were hospitalized. So as you said, a very low number who wound up having to have a serious infection. Yeah. So interesting that the risk was higher in the UC group, as you've said. Any other take-home messages from this particular analysis as far as risk factors are concerned and what clinicians should be looking out for? Yeah,
I mean, I guess one thing is I thought the analysis made sense. So it's always nice when you do a study and the results kind of jive with what other studies suggest or what you think you should find based on the biology. I mean, again, steroids, we always talk about them, and there's no question that 5 milligrams or higher, I mean, there's risk there. And, I think that the story with 10 milligrams versus 5 milligrams, that's pretty well hammered out in terms of risk of viral infections, but just other infections as well. So I think methotrexate came up in that model too, if I remember right. And that's always just kind of an argument, initially going back to the Tofa story was the osteo. Remember, initially we found some increase that seemed to be independently associated with methotrexate, but then that went away, over time as we had more statistical power, and it was really just clearly related to the steroids and not the methotrexate. So I don't know. I'm not sure that methotrexate raises the risk of flu. It might, and it might slightly. I guess that's what this analysis would suggest, but obviously there's reasons why it might. So to see some slight bump would not be surprising.
Now, do you think flu rates, because everyone's wearing masks, actually everyone's not wearing masks anymore, the flu rates will go back? And what other viruses should we be cognizant of, like HPV and other things? Does this give you a kind of a twinkle that you've got to think about other viruses, particularly HPV in young women?
Yeah, I mean, people never talk
on
about
JAKs. I mean, on
yeah,
JAKs.
I mean, so one concern I've always had with JAKs or even B-cell depletion therapy. I mean, you name it. There all these drugs. A lot of these drugs, you worry about kind of surveillance for cancers. You worry about, NK cells, are they doing their job? Are we promoting viral growth in latent viruses like varicella or HPV and things like that? To my knowledge, none of the drugs we have approved for these indications have been found to increase risk of HPV infection or HPV related cancers. But it's something I've always wondered about, and I don't think we've done a lot of systematic investigations to rule out that possibility. It might be nice to do that, particularly with some of the newer agents as they come out. But so far in a lot, we haven't seen an increased risk of cervical cancer, of course, with any of these compounds. So I don't know, though. I think it's an open question. I think, and it does raise, it just reminds us, Peter, like you're saying, I mean, we need to make sure people get vaccinated. And HPV and HPV-related cancers are almost 100% preventable. I mean, it's an amazing public health achievement if you can convince people to get the vaccine at the right time in their life. So, but I would say, in terms of this study and the pandemic and everything, I mean, clearly respiratory viruses are on the map, and it's, we just had a pretty big flu year here. It's trending downward now, and it came after a pretty big year down under where you guys are. I mean, our hospital last month was full of people with flu, not COVID or anything else. It was RSV and flu, and it was just kind of like back to the old days, maybe even a little worse. So, I mean, clearly RSV, flu, SARS-CoV-2. I mean, these are all going to be players for a while until we develop better ways to prevent them. So
there's a bivalent flu COVID shot being developed. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different COVID shots still in development. I think I looked at the WHO website the other day. It was like 165 vaccines still in phase something to something. Yeah, I don't, FDA kind of raised this question here last week as to whether we should be doing annual flu shots and annual COVID shots, in the fall. That has not been decided here yet. The people who met with FDA didn't really address it. I would say I know, a number of us think that that's not necessarily the right thing to do, and that there's really no data at this point to support, vaccinating people for COVID every fall, just like flu. So I think it just remains to be seen where that goes. I suspect it's going to trend towards, targeted subgroup recommendations around immunosuppressed patients or extremely elderly patients that might be recommended for that strategy. But I'll just have to see. I mean, we need more data to really understand when the best time to boost people is, and we just don't know yet.
Well, I was going to say, because here most people have had 3 or 4, and there's no guidance as to when to have the next one. So we'll have to wait and watch that space, I suppose.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to wait. I mean, eventually the annual flu shot's gonna go away too, because we're gonna have better flu shots that produce more robust immunity, and you're not gonna need to keep plugging people every 12 months. So I don't know. I mean, my 2 cents is that we have the wrong strategy for flu. We're doing something now just to toe the line until we get a better vaccine. And now, you see society or governments talking about going down the same path with COVID vaccines. And I think a lot of us who do vaccine research think that, hey, time out, that may not be the best path, at least for the general population. And let's get some more data, and then let's figure out who's really at the highest risk and how best to protect them. So, and some of that depends on the vaccines, of course. So there are more vaccines still coming. And I think ones that more broadly target, variants in general will be the winners, of course.
Can I ask you a bit about that? The anti-vaxxers persist in say the mRNA technology is a dangerous technology. What's your comment on that?
Well, if the Wall Street investors and everybody else who's put all their eggs in that basket are wrong, I guess they might be wrong. However, boy, the train has left the station. I mean, there's a lot of mRNA vaccines in development for a number of viruses, RSV, flu. I mean, some of those are pretty far along, phase 2, phase 3. And they have pretty darn encouraging results to date. So, and do
you see any safety signal?
I mean, so far with those programs, no. And I mean, I think one would argue that sure, there are safety signals with mRNA COVID vaccines, but they're pretty far and few between. I mean, the serious events with those vaccines are quite rare. So I don't know. I haven't seen any adverse event frequencies of anything bad associated with mRNA vaccines that would make me think that, they're going to get run off the track. Adenoviral vector vaccines, I'd be a little more worried about. I mean, clearly they fell out of favor with regards to COVID. There were some clear, major safety problems with them, albeit quite rare. And in certain subgroups of people, but they were concerning enough, people decided to stop using them. So I don't know. There's a lot of adenoviral vector vaccines in development still. So I don't know where that'll all end up. But to me, I mean, clearly the mRNA vaccines have proven to have a higher benefit to risk ratio and probably are.
So you mentioned RSV and GSK just bringing an RSV vax to our country. Broadly speaking, for our immunosuppressed patients, what vaccines should we recommend? Flu, COVID when there's more guidance, Prevnar for pneumococcus, RSV, Haemophilus, what kind of panel should be really thinking about for the high-risk person, the Rtux person and other sort of high-risk people?
You mentioned RSV, and so, what to be giving, of course, is, up to date on shingles vaccine, flu, COVID boosters when it's time again, and we don't know yet. And then the new pneumococcal, the conjugate vaccines. We have PCV20 here. I'm not sure if you guys have it there yet. But that will be coming if it's not there already. You might have PCV15. That would probably be the new one if you don't have the 20. But you also mentioned RSV, and I mean, I think that's something missing from the vaccine armamentarium. It has been for forever. It's primarily a childhood problem. So I think a lot of us as adults haven't really thought about it that much. But of course, in immunocompromised patients and very elderly, it can be a devastating infection. So, we don't have a vaccine yet for those folks, but there is one coming. The GSK program, they use the same adjuvant as they use in Shingrix, and they have one around, I think it's a pre-fusion protein in RSV. And they did present their data at the annual ID week meeting that I go to in the fall. And this was last fall, so just a few months ago. And the phase 3 data looked great in older individuals in terms of efficacy. So I suspect that will come, and I suspect there will be recommendations around using that vaccine in older individuals, particularly those who are immunosuppressed. I don't know that study included immunosuppressed people. I don't think it did. So I think it'll kind of be the same issue as it was with the shingles program. Here's data in the general population, and now we're going to have to do some sub-studies in some of the immunocompromised populations to see how well it works. But I think that is on the horizon.
Okay, so let's just finish off on this paper. It was post hoc, 3 big groups. It says here from 2004 to 2019, so quite a big period of time. It said that the incidences were generally similar between tofa, placebo, and the active comparator. There were minor differences, and have a look at the paper to see the numbers and to make sure you're happy with the different groups. Overall, the data seems to suggest the risk of influenza or the complications in tofa-treated patients was similar to that observed in the general population, which is a bit reassuring. And the incidence of something severe was really quite low, around 1.7%. So any other take-home comments you wanted to make about this paper, Kevin?
Yeah, I think that summarizes it well. I mean, I would just say, hey, it was somewhat reassuring. We didn't really see, elevated risk relative to the comparator groups in those trials. The serious event, proportion of patients isn't too off what we'd expect in the general population, where it's usually kind of 1% are hospitalized or less. So maybe it's a little higher in this, but these were fairly immunosuppressed patients, particularly some subsets of them. And I think our model found the right risk factors, steroids and higher dose tofa. So I mean, it's just another study saying, hey, limit steroids best you can, get people to the lowest dose of immunosuppression as you can, and you'll limit their risk. But yes, I think overall the study made sense, and it was reassuring.
Excellent. So thank you again for your time, Kevin. If you'd like to know more about this paper and others uploaded to the CSF website this month, you can get detailed slide sets and available in the publication section, cytokinesignaling.com. Please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or other podcast media. Give us some feedback. And Kevin, we greatly appreciate your time. And we look forward to chatting again soon and catching up maybe at EULA, having that beer and talking about ophthalmology.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's have a beer. Talk about it. Good to see you, Peter. Yeah, cheers.
All the best. Cheers.